Kate Mosse, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you.
Why do you think that historical fiction is having such a moment right now?
I don't know whether the authors of historical fiction are the people to ask. I expect the readers would have better answers. But I think, for me, I think it is because often people want to feel very important emotions, emotions of love or fear or jealousy or ambition or what would you do in the same situation, but through the prism of experience that isn't ours. So you want to be properly engaged, but in a funny sort of way, reading a book that's set now, in a real place, in a real war, in a real country, it immediately separates you from it, or it makes you, it's too much like the news. But when you read those similar emotions set 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you have all of that proper engagement that you want from a really good novel, but there is this one step removed thing. So I think it's probably that. And also, I know from a lot of my readers, from the emails they send, I think people do like to know stuff, to finish a book and go, oh God, I love those characters, it really moved me, but then also think, and I never knew that. So it's those two things, it's entertainment and learning, and actually the prism of emotion through a different sort of mirror.
So is that part of the appeal for you about investing so much energy in an epic trilogy? It means that all the research that you did for the first book is sort of amortized or extended over 3 books.
Well, oddly, it's not that you use research that you did first time around quite so much, because unfortunately, you know, if you're writing a book, Labyrinth, the first of the trilogy, is set in the 13th century in the modern day. Citadel is set in the 20th century and the 4th century. So, you know, you do the research for it. But what happens, of course, is when you're researching, and this is what I love about research, is you come across some absolutely brilliant story that you cannot use. But then you think, oh, 20 years later you think, oh, that 4th century story about the beginning of Christianity in Gaul, you know what, this is the moment. So with my little standalone novella, The Winter Ghosts, there is a bit of the end of Catharism history there, so the beginning of the 14th century, 1320s. And when I was researching Catharism for Labyrinth, I couldn't use that. My period was 1244. That's when it stopped. You know, the end of the Crusade at Montségur in 1244. But at the back of my mind, I filed this little thing. So it's not that you consciously do all your research in one go. It's more that research gives you jewels that you save up. And what is always odd, you know, certainly writing Citadel, Second World War, I've been reading about the Second World War in Carcassonne for 20 years, but not in such a way that it was good enough research when it came to it. When it comes to it, it's still about, on Tuesday in July in 1944, what time did this happen? I better go and check that. What was the weather like? I better go and check that. So you always have to do the research from scratch once you start writing.
So the trilogy is set in and around the city of Carcassonne in the southwest of France. What brought you to that place in the first place?
Sometimes when I answer this question, I actually turn cold, because the only reason that we were in Carcassonne and that the Languedoc became my second home was my very wonderful mother-in-law was given a small lump sum when she retired from teaching. She worked for many, many years as a teacher of mentally and physically disabled children, and she was given this lump sum when she retired. And my husband had lived in Paris for some years, and I was a publisher, and my husband was a trainee teacher, and we had no money. But we knew that if we could maybe pool our resources and buy a little place somewhere, then at least we'd still have a holiday, because you've got to eat wherever you are. And so it was that daft, and this was about 24 years ago now. And my mother-in-law had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who was an estate agent in Sussex, where we come from, who was twinned with an estate agent in Carcassonne. Never even heard of the place. And so off they went on the train and came back at the end of the weekend saying, "I bought a house." I went, "What? You bought a house without me?" And it was for £15,000. So, I mean, it really was like, some less than people would now pay for a car. And I didn't go there at that time I was pregnant and didn't really want to stray very far from the house. And so I went a few months later, and we got off the train in Carcassonne. We walked down through the Bastille to the modern town. It was November and it was dark and there was nobody about. And we walked across the Pont Vieux, the old bridge which goes over the River Aude, which separates the Bastille side from the medieval city that's there up ahead on the hill. And I just saw it, this medieval fortified city, a crown of stone, sitting on this hill in the drizzle and the dark and the light. And I just thought, oh, I belong here. And it was that visceral a feeling. And of course I look back now and think, that was complete chance. But it did turn out to be my place, you know.
What's the appeal of writing novels where you alternate between two different eras and tell us kind of parallel narratives?
My novels are often referred to as time slip novels, which simply means that there are two different periods of history that happen live on the page. So lots of stories, of course, have things set in the past, but it's almost always seen through the eyes of the present. For me, firstly, I feel that everything about who we are now is a consequence of who we were then. So that we are part of a continuum of experience, both in real life and also in narrative life. So that the characters in the past are not less important than the ones in the present. But also, if you love history and you find the joy of discovering things, part of the pleasure of being a writer of history, then you can't put quite as much real history in if it's only set in the past. Because people in 13th century Carcassonne, 20th century Carcassonne, Sandrine, my lead character in Citadel, they don't walk about going, aren't the clothes good? Oh, did you know that people had wooden soles on their shoes? Because guess what, they know. It's like us now. We don't go around going, oh, mobile phone. But people, you know, in the future will look back at some of the things that we have now and think, God, how quaint. So for me, it's a way of sharing the joy of that discovery. So sometimes having a modern component so that they can go through the same streets as Sandrine will go through, as my lovely Alaïs in Labyrinth will go through. And the reader will have that sense, I hope, of the shiver of the past. So that a reader will, certainly through the series of the 3 books, think, I've seen that young woman walk along this path. And now I've seen this person walk along the path. And now as a 21st century reader, going to Carcassonne, holding Citadel, or Sepulchre, or Labyrinth, I too can walk through that path. And I will have the echo of all those women and men in my head. And of course, my characters are imagined characters, but they are inspired by the sort of people who lived there. And that's why we always do a walk at the end of each of the books, and why I'm told that the tour guides in the Chateau Cantal actually use Labyrinth as part of their tour. And that gives me great pleasure, because the inspiration for me is absolutely that I feel when I stand on a street corner and I put my hand on the stone of those walls, I do feel that I'm standing where people have stood for hundreds and thousands of years, and that other people will stand there when I'm long gone and in the ground. And I think that's wonderful. I feel part of something, and that's how I write. I try to do it the same way.
You've tackled a period of French history that the French still feel ambivalent about today. Their role in the Second World War is a complex one with lots of mythology and lots of unresolved history. Was that what was appealing to you about tackling World War II?
That was what nearly made me not do it. It wasn't appealing at all, actually. I feel that we are too close, even now, to really be able to understand the emotions of what it felt like to be occupied and what it did to French society, the poison of collaboration. The war wasn't the poison, it was collaboration that was the poison. And in many respects, the enemy, in inverted commas, I suppose, were fellow Frenchmen and women who decided that this was going to be the New World Order, and they would embrace it enthusiastically, not just live with it, but embrace it enthusiastically. But I'm not sure any of us can quite understand how we would feel or react in those circumstances. It's the thing that I always say is that the Germans crossed the demarcation line on the 11th of November 1942. Up until that point, so the first 2 years of the war, Carcassonne had been in the so-called free zone. Nobody had seen any German soldiers on the streets, not really. They hadn't seen the consequences of occupation at that point. We know that that's halfway through the war. They didn't. Might have been forever. So it doesn't behoove us to make judgments in quite that sort of way, and I'm not a historian. My job as a historian is to tell a story of very brave women and the men who love them, and see where that takes my characters and where it takes the reader. But I felt very anxious about doing it, because it is, as you say, so raw still. And when the archives, the big archives, start to be opened in the next couple of years, there will be many stories that have been told which will turn out not to be true. And I don't really want to be in the middle of that. But so I've written the book absolutely as an outsider, as a novelist, as someone who loves Carcassonne, and felt that I shouldn't shy away from writing the last piece of the jigsaw, for me, of the different key moments in Carcassonne history. And the Second World War, of course, is absolutely fundamental to what the town is now, because all of the names of the resistance fighters of Carcassonne who died so that everybody else could have the lives we now have are commemorated on the walls in the centre of the town. So you cannot escape it.
So tell us briefly what happens in Citadel.
Citadel is a tribute to the very brave women of the resistance of the Southwest, most of whom are absent on the pages of the history book for all sorts of reasons. And it was inspired by knowing that the Carcassonne resistance were all caught over the course of July and August 1944, were all murdered brutally on the 19th of August 1944. They were taken to a place outside of Carcassonne, and they all had hand grenades put in their mouths, and they were blown up so that they could never be identified. And it was an act of quite extraordinary spite that still nobody quite knows why. And what is even worse is that the Germans left that night. So for the want of a few hours, they would have made it. They would have got through the war and been part of the procession of the men of the resistance and some women who came down from the hills on the 20th and paraded through their town. Carcassonne liberated itself. It's an extraordinary thing. No Allied troops were there, no French soldiers were there. And the pictures are so moving. But so to know that for the want of a few hours, it could have been them too. And that's always really struck me. And over the years, the resistance fighters have been identified. The leader of the resistance, whose codename was Muriel, a man called Champranger. The deputy leader, the most romantic for me in a way of the lot, Émile Raymond, who scratched his last will and testament on the wall of the jail in Carcassonne with a pin in Occitan. And he was a serving police officer, so imagine the bravery of him. And then all the other men. And at the bottom of the memorials that are there in the place that they were murdered, there is a line that says, "and 2 unknown women." And I don't know who they are. Nobody knows who they are. But I thought, I know the sort of women they might have been. And I'd like to think they could be me or anyone watching this. And so the story came out of that.
Thank you very much, Kate Mosse.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.